Good afternoon. I'm Marilyn Herron, Director of the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education and Professor of Religious Studies and History at Chapman University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this Zoom event presented by the Rogers Center and co-sponsored by the Department of History and the Department of World Languages and Culture. This event coincides with the time of my class on Weimar, Germany. And so it is a very special opportunity for students in that course to hear from a world-renowned scholar for whom the events that occurred in Berlin and Vienna in the 1930s have personal meaning. For our speaker, Dr. Marjorie Perloff was born Gabriela Mintz into an assimilated Jewish family in Vienna. In the immediate aftermath of the Anschluss, or annexation of Austria by Germany in 1938, she, along with her parents and older brother, fled to Switzerland and later to the United States. Dr. Perloff has spoken frequently at Chapman University, and we are honored that she is a presidential fellow here. No brief introduction can adequately introduce a scholar whose curriculum vitae exceeds 65 pages, and who is the author of more than a dozen groundbreaking books. Dr. Perloff is Professor Emerita at both USC and Stanford University. In June 2021, Dr. Perloff was honored with the Austrian Cross of Honor for Science and Art, the highest Austrian distinction in culture and science. You can see from the first slide the topic on which Dr. Perloff will speak today. We hope to have a few minutes for questions after Dr. Perloff's talk. We would ask you to please use the Q&A function, not the chat, to post your questions, and the Associate Director of the Rogers Center, Jessica Milamuk, will moderate. Thank you for joining us. And now, Dr. Perloff.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herron. I'm delighted to be here and to address your seminar on the Weimar Republic. I've been studying the syllabus. It's a very exciting course. It's now coming to an end as the semester is going to come to an end, but it is all so apropos today. You know, often people ask me, is there a parallel between Weimar and its end and today? And I used to say no, but as time is going on, I'm changing my mind somewhat. I thought it would be interesting for you, since I am Viennese, to talk about the parallel thing that was going on. After all, Hitler's from Vienna. And I thought it would be interesting, since you've been studying Germany, the class has been studying Germany, and most people think of this period, of course, from the German perspective, to see what was going on in the Austria of the time, which in many ways was worse. It's interesting that the Anschluss and Hitler didn't come to Austria till 1938, but the fact is, as you'll see, there are many great problems. And a lot of this is going to be based on a book by Brigitte Hamann, Hitler's Wien. You see it there on the left. Lehrjahre, the learning years of a dictator. It has been translated into English. There's a new edition in German in 2022 with additions from other scholars. And the English edition came out in 2011, but I use the German because the English is abridged somewhat. And there are many interesting things actually in the German. It's a very, I think, important book because we don't usually think about that. Well, what about, what was going on in Austria? Now, here is a map. I want to begin by showing you the map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, which was then going to end. At that time, it was still an empire of 55 million, stretching from the Alps in the west, here we are in the Tyrol, to the Dalmatian coast and Trieste in the south, to Krakow up here, which is now, of course, Poland, and in the north, and to Tarnopol and Czernowitz here. The poet Paul Celan, for instance, comes from Bukovina. That was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It then became Romania, and part of Romania, but now this part here would be Ukraine, but there was no Ukraine then. And if I go on to the, just show you for a minute, the map after 1919, the current map in many ways, here's Austria now, a little country, reduced to this little country. What was Galicia became Poland and Russia and so on. The map changed completely. Romania, there's still no Ukraine. There was no Ukraine between the two wars. It was part of Russia. And so that's interesting to think about. But I also want you to take this into account. And let me, okay. But if you go back here, you know, to the map, to the original map, and see that size, you can see how traumatic it was after World War I. But we're going to be talking about a slightly earlier period. To have this huge empire completely destroyed. And it happened, my grandfather in his memoir talks about it. He was a diplomat. It literally happened overnight. What happened overnight was that in 1919, after Woodrow Wilson had managed to divvy up all the various countries, and that had happened, they came back to the ministry, and my grandfather had worked for somebody Czech, and the Czechs were there. There were 2 or 3 important Czechs, and they didn't know what to do. And then the word came that they were now supposed to leave. They weren't part of Austria anymore. They were part of Czechoslovakia, so they left. And then all kinds of very difficult things happened. In any case, you had in this empire a dozen nationalities: Italians, Slovenes, Czechs, Slovaks, Bosnians, Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians. They coexisted in what was a polyglot, multicultural monarchy with the Emperor Franz Joseph at its head, the dual monarchy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In 1867, and that's an important date to remember, the emperor offered emancipation to the Jews. And that meant from then on, they could be citizens. Many Germanized their names. And from now on, they could live wherever they liked, though not buy property in many places, attend all public schools, universities, and be civil servants, open businesses, pursue professions. Now, in Vienna, in 1860, the Jews were 2.2% of the population. By 1870, it was 6.6%. 1880, more than 10%, a ratio that held till 1938. That meant that by the 1880s, because the Jews were very successful, by the 1880s, 61% of the physicians were Jewish, 50% of the lawyers. Journalism, the arts, retail trade, finance, banking, the textile industry, grain, the railway network were all heavily Jewish. The Jews owned almost all the newspapers, which was a very dangerous and bad thing, and something to think about, because we have it in this country, not quite to that degree, but we do have it to some degree. The New York Times, owned by the Sulzberger family. More so than in Germany, where the Weimar Republic had 0.9% or less than 1% Jews, Vienna had that 10%, and which is a lot more than Berlin. Berlin at the same period, which the class has been studying, has 4%. Which is certainly a lot less. Now, Hitler's hatred of the Jews must be understood against this background. His father, here's his father, Alois Schicklgruber. His name was Schicklgruber because he was an illegitimate child, so he was named for his mother, and that was her name. And then he managed to somehow get his father's name and became Hitler, later renamed Hitler. He was married 3 times. The third marriage to Angelica Raubai was the marriage to which Adolf Hitler was born. And Alois, this charming-looking man, had a violent temper, regularly beat his children, and retired at the age of 58 from being a customs official. How he got that job, I don't quite understand, but I guess it was not very taxing. And after that, he spent much time at various cafes and pubs, arguing with people, reading the daily papers, pronouncing on things, was very interested in völkisch, folk, but völkisch always has a derogatory connotation, nationalism. The mother was evidently sweet and devout, cleaned her house, was not at all a bad person, and Hitler, the son, was devoted to his mother, it must be said. So Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, and it's interesting that he was born 6 days before Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of my idols that I write about a lot, and also the same year that Heidegger was born. It's amazing to me that all 3 of these people were born in the same year, Hitler, Heidegger, Wittgenstein. And he was born in Linz, a provincial city. Here you see Linz, quite a distance from Austria, so north. Here it is, the provincial city, and the Salzburg down here. This is the Austria of today. At his time, Linz had 68,000 inhabitants, so relatively small. He went to a local school, and in 1900 was enrolled in the Linzer Realschule. It's probably all painted and fixed up a little now, maybe for tourists. But anyway, this is where he went to, let's say, middle school and most of high school. And the great irony is in the Realschule in Linz that Wittgenstein was sent to the same school, came from Vienna, but was sent to this school, but they didn't know each other. And Wittgenstein, although the same age, was way ahead of Hitler, who was left back a few times, I think. And they didn't know each other, although everybody tries to write novels and figure what would have been like if they had met and knew each other and so on. There are whole books about that. Anti-Semitism played no role as yet, because in the entire province of Oberösterreich, which Linz is in 1900, there weren't more than 1,100 Jews. That's less than 1%. Nobody really talked about them. The outsiders at that time were the Czechs. The Czechs were next door and were great workers, very good industrial workers, and would come over and get jobs. And there was antagonism because they didn't speak German, and they were often seasonal workers. Hitler's father died in 1903 at the age of 65 when Adolf was 13. His mother was now impoverished, and she became ill with lung disease. And the family doctor was Jewish. Dr. Edward Bloch was Jewish. He later remembered Hitler as a polite, well-brought-up boy who bowed when he came into the doctor's office and adored his mother. And later, Hitler actually tried to help Bloch escape and go to the United States. So as a child, he was not, or as a even young teenager, he was not all that bad yet. As a teenager, he came to love theater and opera. He made friends with a boy named Gustav Kubitschek, and the two of them went to whatever was available that they could go to, anything arty. But he soon decided he wanted to be an artist, and he had his heart set on Vienna. He took on no trade or apprenticeship, and in 1906, at the age of 17, he made his first visit to the capital. Now, when you see this picture of the Ringstrasse, bear in mind, Vienna was already electrified at this stage, whereas Linz was probably all dark. The provincial cities didn't even have, they barely had electricity, but Vienna had electric lights all over, and Hitler was completely enchanted. He thought it was like the 1001 Nights. He couldn't get over the mansions on the Ringstrasse, the opera, the things that he just loved. And I'll just show you some pictures. Here's the Opera House. And this picture of the Opera House is by Hitler. You know, Hitler thought of himself as an artist. He didn't make it, but he did draw things. And this was his drawing with the tram there. And it actually is not a bad drawing. I mean, I couldn't do it, you know, certainly in that way. But anyway, that's a drawing he made. And here's the Rathaus. Here's the Burgtheater, the famous, wonderful theater, the Burgtheater. And here is the Kunsthistorisches Museum. So that gives you some idea. Now, what Hitler didn't like was modern architecture. Here's Adolf Loos's famous house on the Michaelerplatz. I've actually been in there. It has a Loden shop to go shopping in, and was considered very, interesting. And here's a suburban Adolf Loos house, the Steiner house. Hitler never had any use for modernism. Later, it was all in Arte de Kunst and so forth. But even quite aside from the just the formal part, he sort of hated that. And it was not just because it was Jewish and Adolf Loos was not, but he had no use for that. Well, he wrote to Kubitschek that he had a chance to see Wagner's Parsifal at the Vienna Opera. And I found a picture of it here. This is dated 1910. So it's just a little bit later than Hitler first came to Vienna. And there is the famous Hermann Winckelmann as Parsifal. And Hitler was in love with Wagner, as you probably heard. And Wagner was very anti-Semitic and pretty bad person too. He went to the Meistersinger 10 times. He couldn't get over how much he loved that. And it's interesting because when he went to the opera, he only could afford standing room only. And if you went standing room only, he couldn't afford to check his coat, and you weren't allowed to wear a coat in standing room only. You took up too much room. So he would not wear a coat and go even in the cold weather and see what he could do and join. At this time, Gustav Mahler, was the director of the Vienna Opera, a job that he was soon going to lose because people did object to a Jew having this job. And then the new director was Felix von Weingartner, who dropped many of Mahler's singers and orchestra players because they were Jews. Okay. In 1908, Hitler came back to Vienna for good. His mother had died. He had paid the family. She had terminal cancer. He cared for her assiduously. She died at age 47. He wrote notes thanking Dr. Bloch for his care. He came to see his mother, Clara, almost every day. And then he paid the family bills as much as he could, left his siblings behind, and with just enough money, very little, went to Vienna for good. And his intention was, as you probably know, to become an artist. He wanted to get into art school, the Kunstakademie, but he flunked the entrance exam twice. So he couldn't do it. And he couldn't blame the Jews for that because his examiners were certainly not Jewish. After that, he became a kind of, what shall I say, flaneur by French norms or whatever. He ran around, he enjoyed himself. He went out as much as he could. He wasn't really making any money. He had never been apprenticed or learned any trade. And so he was dirt poor. And the first place that he lived with Kubitschek was in the Stumpfergasse in the Sechstenbezirk, 6th district, which is sort of southwest of the inner city. And it doesn't look so bad there, but in the next picture, his entrance was back here. Excuse me. His entrance was, back here. And you see the sign that says, "Der Führer wohnte hier," which they had up. In diesem Hause, in this house, the Führer lived in 1907. And although it doesn't look quite so bad here, there's a shoemaker next door, a butcher over here. Evidently, the plumbing in all these buildings, housing in Vienna was absolutely terrible. And it's one of the downfalls of the place because the rich lived very well, even the middle class lived quite well. But if you were poor, you lived in a place that had no bathroom. In here, Hitler evidently had a bathroom that for about 20 people. And there were bed bugs, there were rats. It was, and his house back in Linz, whatever else, had been a very clean house. His mother kept a very clean house. So he resented this, certainly, but there isn't very much that he could do about it. By 1909, he had a friend named Hanisch, who suggested that one way he could make a living was by painting little postcards. So that's what he did for a couple of years. He did watercolors and sold these postcards. And that was his job. He didn't make very much with it. For the rest of the time he stayed in Vienna, which was till 1913 when he moved to Munich. And that was goodbye to the whole thing. But anyway, while he was here, he did these postcards and his friend Hanisch would sell them and so on. And one of the things that Hitler loved to do in this period, and it's very interesting to read about in Brigitte Hamann's book, is he went to Parliament all the time. Now, why Parliament? He sat through endless sessions of Parliament because he was trying to learn how it works. And in this day and age, it worked like this. There were all those nationalities I told you about. And so they could talk those languages. So somebody would get up and make a speech in Hungarian or a speech in Czech or whatever, the Slavs and so on. And then the German speakers, who of course were the dominant group, the important group, never listened. They didn't really pay any attention, but they let them make their speech. They couldn't really understand what the hell they were saying. And everybody had their say, and then the Germans would sort of decide things. And when his friend Gustav Kubitschek asked, "Why do you want to spend your day here watching Parliament? Most of it is very dull." He said, no, it's very important. I'm learning how it works. And that to me is a very important thing. And at the time, women didn't have the vote yet. And by the way, women also were, in the opera, for instance, couldn't be in the standing room only group at all. Women were discriminated against all kinds of ways. Even most of the men had only gotten a vote in 1907. And in the Parliament, when Hitler watched it, there were the following division. There were 96 Christian socials, the Christian Social Party, like the current party that it was Angela Merkel's party, say, in Germany. There were 86 socialists, known as the Sozis, for short, Sozis, 31 of the German Volkspartei, pretty conservative, 28 Czech agriculture, etc., more small parties. No party had the majority. There were constant fights in the Reichstag, which is the parliament. There were 10 languages spoken, and Hitler loved observing the squabble, like the Tower of Babel. For instance, there were fights against the gypsies. How are we going to get rid of the gypsies? Many of the parties agreed on that. They were very cruel to that. He learned how power worked. He learned how problematic it was to have a plethora of parties. Now, those of you who have been studying the Weimar Republic, this led to Hitler's conviction that what was needed was ein Volk, ein Führer. One folk, one Führer. That's very important. You cannot run a country with all these little splinter parties, which you had later in Weimar, constant switches of parties, constant switches of control, that is a deadly solution. Nothing is going to work. Don't forget, nobody really knew what democracy was, because at the time of the Kaiser in Germany and at the time of the Emperor Franz Joseph, there was really no, the rules were made. There was really no real democracy. In these years, Hitler was dead broke. He was homeless. In essence, he was a homeless person. He got meals in various charitable soup kitchens, watery soup, a piece of bread. There were bed bugs and all that. Many lived in the canals where there were the really rats, the canals that if you ever saw The Third Man, you've seen. So this was Hitler's low point. And Hanisch suggested that he move into Brigitte now, which doesn't look so bad there, and it actually wasn't so bad. It was a men's dormitory in the 20th Bezirk, 20th district, pretty far north, not so far from the inner city, really. And it had a reading room, 2 libraries, in fact, one where you could smoke, one where you couldn't, and everybody had their own room. And to pay, you just left very little money. It was like, shall I say, it was like the YMCA, not quite, and it was pretty seedy in its way, but it was okay. At least you weren't out in the streets and you weren't in the homeless shelters where Hitler had lived for quite some time. It was very cheap. Everybody, as I say, had their own room. There was limited electricity. Today, this district is a heavily Turkish district and a kind of poor district. But anyway, so that's where Hitler lived. And the food there was cheap, and they had the dining room and all that. There was a doctor on the premises, a disinfection room, a washroom, and so on. So now you have to picture Hitler, the young Hitler, sitting in the non-smoking reading room at about age 20, painting his little picture postcards. And his friend Reinhold Hanisch also painted watercolors for advertising. Hitler would paint whatever tourists wanted. And then Hanisch was the peddler who sold them. And the irony is they were sold often to Jews. They painted the Stephansdom, the churches. They copied old engravings. They made souvenirs. Later, these works were praised as great works of art by the Nazi Party. Couldn't get going without reading them first. And so this is where Hitler was. Now, the young Hitler was not yet an anti-Semite. On the contrary, he was reading Lessing's Nathan the Wise, and he declared the Jews were the first civilized nation because they rejected polytheism and believed in one God. He started out that way. And to those who said Jews could not be artists, Hitler cited Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, Jacques Offenbach, and actually argued that, yes, they could be artists, and that he believed in the 10 Commandments. He had learned those back in Linz. In these early days, he had a number of Jewish friends with names like Neumann, Schlosser. They discussed Zionism, which he didn't like, but he was not yet overtly hostile. But that was all going to change. By 1910 and 11, he broke off for some reason with his friend Hanisch, and he started reading race theory. And race theory is very big in this period. It is almost unbearable today to read, if you think things about today as far as race goes, to read the race theory I'm going to talk about in a minute. Hitler was an autodidact. He read slowly and painfully books, brochures, newspapers, whatever he could find in that reading room. Don't forget, there's no radio yet, there's no TV, but the newspapers therefore had an enormous influence, just even reading the headlines. So many of the nationalities of the empire, formerly held to be a good thing, began to be criticized under the new Darwinist machine. And early 19th century nationalism became exaggerated in the later 19th century and early 20th as a view that we must have racial purity. That was the call. And here are some of the people involved. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was an Englishman, but then lived in Bayreuth in Germany, died in Germany. Was one of the first people to make the case mid-century, mid-19th century, for purifying the race, getting rid of the genetically weak, that we must have strong males. Assimilation could never work, nor conversion. Jews were Jews. And by the way, in Vienna, not my immediate family, but certainly other parts of my family were baptized. Everybody thought if they just got baptized, life would be fine. And they really didn't want to be Jewish particularly anyway. That's a whole interesting issue, because many of them felt the Wittgenstein family was like this, who were already baptized by 1850 or so, that just because they had some ancestor who was Jewish, if they didn't believe the religion, why did they have to be Jewish and be punished for it? So they were mostly baptized as Protestants, some, like the Wittgenstein family, as Catholics. But in fact, it didn't do them any good at all, because from the point of view of racial purity, assimilation was even worse than no assimilation. It didn't do them any good at all. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was married to Eva, the daughter of Wagner. He lived in Bayreuth, as I said, and he wrote that one must work to create the new healthy man. Lots of ancestry investigation. Biosocial origins were thought, and these terms began to appear like the Herrenmensch, the master man, the master race, from Nietzsche, and the Untermensch, the not fully human being. They were against democracy and a parliamentary ethos, and the idea that there should be a search for a strong German leader. The hierarchy of races was introduced, and this was while there was still the Kaiser, after all, and then Bismarck, so it's kind of amazing. But the race had to be purified, and that meant high versus low, pure versus mixed, Germanic versus Slavic. To be Slavic was lower than low, and that went on right into the middle of the 20th century, still goes on to some degree. The German nationalists had actually wanted Anschluss. They thought of themselves as German. They would have liked to have Anschluss, but it didn't work out for various reasons, even after World War I. And then when Woodrow Wilson was running the League of Nations, they were forbidden to have Anschluss. So they had to be a separate country. So there was certainly no equality. And but they were slogans like Austria is German or it is nothing. They shouldn't have to conquer new lands. Don't forget, Germany didn't have all the colonies that England had and France had. They had very few colonies because they came into the game late, because Germany was unified so late, not till 1870, the separate little fiefdoms. And there were slogans like Austria is German or it is nothing. The German race had to become a healthy, powerful race. And somebody even more influential was Guido von List, a German named Guido von List, born in 1848, who ran a secret society. He took on the fun. He wasn't fun at all. He was just Guido List. But he revived the methodology or mythology of the old German mythological tales of German glory. And Aryan, the big thing now became the Aryan race. I put it over here for you. And he did the etymology of Aryan and decided R had meant in early German Sonne, sun, and Ri means to come forth and witness. And so Aryans are people who come forth from the sun. And all those myths that the Germans came from the North Pole, which made them superior, Nordic. The swastika was already one of Guido von List's favorite things, spelled swastika, which meant good luck, lucky. The swastika, he was very enthusiastic about that, and the coming from the North Pole. So the aim is to bring back the pure Aryan race, avoid the contamination of mixing. Mischlinge are people of mixed race. Mischlinge played a great part then for Hitler, because if you had just 1 out of 4 Jewish grandparents, you could be a Mischlinge. That wasn't quite impossible. You might actually make it, not be sent to a concentration camp and so forth. 2 Jewish grandparents was already pretty bad. Then you weren't really a Mischling, and there were all kinds of things that happened with that. But anyway, the aim is to bring back the pure Aryan race, so there can't be democracy or no right to vote. Internationalism is the enemy. Cosmopolitanism, bad word. The enemy of the Aryan race. Jews are dangerous nomads who try to penetrate the Aryan race. The race fight took on religious overtones with the swastika as its symbol. And the fire god was Schweizig, which is the root of swastika. So Hitler was always enthusiastic about ancient German deities. After all, he loved Wagner so much. And there are all those great mythological figures, and Brunhilde, Parsifal, and so on. In any case, he started reading all these books and was completely taken with them. And the idea of a new blonde, tall Aryan being, the irony being that Hitler himself was short and dark, not tall at all, and certainly not blonde and blue-eyed, but short and rather dark. But maybe just for that reason, he wanted that. And there are a number of other figures at the same time. We don't need to look at every one, but just a few more. And don't forget that Hitler used anything at hand, newspapers, popular writings, magazines, whatever he could find, brochures, journals, and he built up a theory of the survival of the fittest, a kind of form of Darwinianism, that the strong will prevail, and we have to make it possible for the strong to prevail. Another person was Georg Schönerer, very famous at the time. He was one of Hitler's early models, regularly wrote for the Alldeutsches Tageblatt. Dates are 1842 to 1921. He was the son of a railroad pioneer, Matthias Schönerer, and an employee, whose father, by the way, was an employee of the House of Rothschild, knighted by Franz Joseph in 1860. His wife was a great-granddaughter of R. Samuel Loeb Cohen, so Jewish. But by the 1880s, the fight was against the Jews. They stood for dangerous internationalism contra Bismarck. And so Schönerer conveniently forgot that he had any Jewish blood and considered himself an ardent pro-German. And again, considered the Jews, the Slavs, any outsiders as dangerous. Now, you see, as long as the empire was intact before World War I, and you had all the different nationalities, you couldn't do much about all these enemies. But later on, of course, they became the target. The Slavs, certainly the Jews, even more so. Schönerer was almost too extreme for even most of the Austrians. He wanted all Catholics to convert to Protestantism, as in Germany, he thought that was better. But Hitler adored him. He made him a martyr after he was kicked out of court circles for extremism, and always admired Schönerer very much. And there was the motto, for instance, in German, was Deutsch ist, wird früher oder später zu Deutschland zurückkehren. That which is German will return sooner or later to Germany. We should keep up our fight also against the black and red enemies. Not that blacks played any real part here, but if they did it all, they were the enemy, and down with the Jews. Just openly stated that way. And another big slogan was durch Reinheit zu Einheit, through cleanliness to one nation, ein Volk. The only way you can do it is by cleaning, by cleansing the folk. All the Reich areas should be combined. And so you got a rampant nationalism, the beginning of very serious nationalism. By the 1880s, Schönerer's fight was against the Jews primarily. First of all, the Russian Jews who fled the pogroms that were going on. And he said, we must limit the emigres, and the aim is to free Germany and Austria from Verjudung, making it Jewish. Ob Jud, ob Christ ist einerlei, in der Rasse liegt die Schweinerei. Lovely poem. Whether Jewish or Christian doesn't matter. It's in race where the Schweinerei, Schwein is pig, the piggery, the awful thing takes place. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Christian. He means whether they're baptized or not. It doesn't make any difference. It's in their race that you have this debasement. That gave Schönerer the license to go after the Jews with edicts and laws. And in the schools, there was a numerus clausus limitation of the Jews. And he said overtly, and all these people would say overtly, that anti-Semitism is the heart of a healthy folk consciousness. At one rally, the sign Juden verboten appeared. Early on, these were before the turn of the century. So Schönerer really went after the Jews. He accused Rothschild of raising the price of coal. He told his audience to beware of the Jewish press. the Jews were not true Germans or true Austrians. And there was a list, I found this amazing, of acceptable names. Dietrich, Gerwald, Heinrich, those were acceptable names. And for girls, Waldeborg, Gisela, Mathilde. But there were other names that were suspect right away, even though they told the Jews to take German names, like Rosenthal. The women were supposed to be housewives. They wore no makeup, simple clothes in this group. And the idea was gymnastics for strong bodies, both for male and female. And at the university, abstinence, vegetarianism was big, back to the soil, and no alcohol. The most important from the point of view of Vienna and Hitler was Karl Lueger, der schöne Karl, known as der schöne Karl, the beautiful Karl Lueger, who was the mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910. So right at Hitler's dates. Now, actually, Karl Lueger had many accomplishments. He was from the Christian Social Party, but he was deeply anti-Semitic. He did a lot for Vienna. He turned it into a modern metropolis, into one of the largest cities in the world, and a beautiful city. Industry and incorporation of the suburbs, the Donau, the river region. He brought in gas and electricity. The water was improved. He built schools and hospitals, gas works, baths, savings banks, vis-a-vis Jewish ones. The electric streetcars replaced horse-drawn trams. Very modern hospitals set in the middle of parks. So Karl Lueger was very much loved with all his beautification projects for Vienna. Parks, a lot of green areas. So his party won as much as all the other parties combined. And despite the Jews, he got a huge majority in the one election after another. Now, here in the Karl Lueger Platz, there's the statue, and I got a recent request just about a month ago. I got a letter from Vienna, from somebody I know in Vienna, asking me if I would contribute to the taking down of this statue. Notice they graffiti all over it now. They haven't taken it down yet, but they're going to. And I thought a lot about that. I'm not much for taking statues down. I never even knew there was a statue here. And I think the more attention you call to them, in a way, the worse. I walked through that square many times and I never looked to see whose statue, what is it? But it is true that there is a statue of Karl Lueger there, and that many people find that offensive. And just recently, you can now see, right, the graffiti on the statue on the other side too. And I imagine within about they're trying very hard in Vienna now to get away from all this. So it may be taken down. In 1890, Karl Lueger made a very well-known speech against the Jews. The Kaiser was not pleased because, interestingly, the Kaiser von Joseph was not particularly anti-Semitic. After all, he had given the great, had the Emancipation Proclamation for them, and he didn't take it very seriously, and he didn't hate them the way Karl Lueger did. But anyway, here's just a little part of that speech by Karl Lueger. In Vienna, there are Jews just as there's sand along the seashore. In the Ringstrasse, nothing but Jews. In the theater, nobody but Jews. In the Stadtpark, nobody but Jews. At the concert, nobody but Jews. At a ball, nobody but Jews. At the university, nobody but Jews. Gentlemen, I can't help it that almost all our journalists are Jews, and so on. I can't help it if they spread the interests of capitalism. But he wouldn't reject them all. And there's the famous statement by Karl Lueger, wer ein Jude ist, who is a Jew, I decide. Who is a Jew, I decide. And he had some Jewish friends. He made exceptions. He was a good judge of character. But of course, he couldn't placate his enemies by bringing them under one umbrella. And it was always that notion that the Jew is guilty for various reasons. First of all, he's a Christ killer. Second of all, it's for liberalism, capitalism, money, and the stock market. And they're the press Jews and the ink Jews, the intellectuals, the Sozi Jews, and so on. So he made himself the microphone of his voters. And Saturday afternoon, he said in Vienna, the poor manual worker must go as a beggar so as to make his hands worthwhile, begging at Jewish furniture dealers for small jobs. We have to free these people. You did have the situation by 1910 that only half the population of Vienna had been born in Vienna. Notice how similar that is to certain things we have in this country now. Only half had been born in Vienna. They were all immigrants. So that led to a virulent nationalism and the Germanization of Vienna. It was considered a German city, no longer the capital of Austro-Hungary. Well, Lueger died on March 10th, 1910. He had a grand funeral, like a state funeral. The shops were closed. There was a grand parade with flags. The young Hitler witnessed it all, and he learned how to organize the masses, or he thought he did. Lueger was the first bourgeois leader in Austria. He replaced democracy with demagogy, and he became a big cult figure. So Hitler didn't think either party, the Christian Socials or the Sozis, was any good, and he decided party is not the answer. Hitler also thought Lueger was not nearly as hard as he should have been on the Jews. One should concentrate on the enemy and have ein Volk and eine Partei. And that, of course, was at the heart of fascism. So the first enemy that Hitler had, though, was not so much the Jews as the Czechs. I said that before. He was terribly worried about the Slavicization, hearing Czech spoken on the street in Vienna. Between 1851 and 1910, the Czech population multiplied tenfold. Prague became a Czech city, had just been part of the empire. There was the fear of immigration. They came as industrial workers, they spoke no German, and that infuriated Hitler. The Czech, he said, is of all the nationalities the most dangerous because he's so industrious and he wants to take over. He should be shipped back to the east. So that was the first group, and then came the Jews. The immediate result, of course, of Franz Josef's edict was immigration into Vienna. I gave you the figures before. First, workers from Hungary, Galicia. I have relatives from Galicia. The city of Lviv, which is now in the news all the time, in Ukraine, which was called in German Lemberg. I have two uncles who come from Lemberg. It's a beautiful city. All those were beautiful cities. It's built by Viennese architects and were originally part of Galicia. By 1910, I said there were 175,000 practicing Jews in Vienna, but many more that were baptized. So it's really hard to know how many. And most of those were ambitious, often cultured Jews, which had little competition in the Catholic conservative milieu, because there wasn't a very active middle class. There were either the aristocrats, the elegant people who had their horses and so forth, who had no use for new art or new ideas and were not especially ambitious, and the lower classes, and the middle class was the Gentile middle class was small. By 1912, 1 out of 3 gymnasium students, 1 out of 3 gymnasium students were Jewish. In my father's gymnasium, the Akademisches Gymnasium, which was the most elegant one in Vienna, and the high school, the gymnasium, is what counted, because the university was just a big public university where you could go. You might never graduate or finish the course, but it wasn't elegant in that same way. Ernst Gombrich, the famous art historian, went to the Theresianum. That was the most elegant of all. That's where all the aristocrats went. I don't know how he got in. He was then, of course, exiled and was in England, but had been baptized a Lutheran and so on. There was lots of baptism and assimilation. If we include the Realschule, we could almost say that in Vienna, a good almost half the population of the educated population certainly were Jewish, a third of the university students. The favorite subjects were medicine, law, and the Viennese Jews too loved Mahler, and they loved Wagner, and the German classical writers, plus Kafka and Schnitzler and Stefan Zweig and Freud, who were their own writers. So in politics, and those of you who've been studying Weimar, of course, know this, the Jews were liberal or socialist. They were for freedom. That is one of the great problems, because then the hatred is so great. And it's true in this country in many ways. The Jews are not likely to be conservative. In this country, there's some. In England, they're probably not. They're just by nature almost tend to be liberal or socialist. And of course, in Germany, you have both a big socialist party and the Communist Party. And if those parties had joined forces, Hitler never would have gotten anywhere. You realize that because the Nazi Party didn't get that much of the vote, but the communists in Germany hated the socialists, called them fascists, and the same thing was true in Vienna. The Socialist Party was very active. The very first prime minister after World War I who was elected was a socialist, Otto Bauer, but he lasted exactly 1 year. The next president was a Catholic priest, Seipel, and from then on, they were all from the other parties, the Christian Social Party or the German National Party. Dollfuss had been a priest too, who was one of the prime ministers. So they could never get all the vote because of the countryside. Of course, anti-Semitism was especially bad. Now, all this Jewish success bred rampant anti-Semitism among the natives. First among the factory workers who feared the competition, the shopkeepers, and as early as 1876, a medical professor, Theodor Billroth, questioned assimilation and said the Jews could never become real Germans. They would always be their own nation because they're Eastern. Now, what does that mean? And he gave the youth a chance to attack them. Part of the problem was that it was always held the Jews, who are they? They're not part of our country. They're certainly not really Germans or Austrians. They're outsiders. They come from somewhere in the East, the irony being Jews don't originally come from Eastern Europe at all, but they come from the East and they infiltrate. And some of them, the recent arrivals, might have had dreadlocks. It's like the problem in Israel today, the hats, the long coats. They didn't speak German. They spoke Yiddish. So Hitler despised these people. And Joseph Roth wrote brilliantly about the issue, how no modernized Western Jew wanted to have anything to do with an uncle from Lodz or Katowice who arrives in town. And it is true that the Jews themselves were quite anti-Semitic. Kennedy, who was a Sephardic Jew, the writer Kennedy, very hard on the Eastern Jews. His mother refused to even speak to them. They thought, we're not really Jews, we're different, we're special. So the Western assimilated Jews felt that way about the Jews in the Leopoldstadt. The new arrivals had no use for them. And Hitler was furious about this influx of poor Russian Jews. And later in Mein Kampf, he talks about that a lot, that the Jews, he said, didn't want equality. They wanted control. They wanted power. And Trotsky, on the eve of World War I, very good looking Trotsky, lived in Vienna, was in all the cafes. My grandfather knew him fairly well. Everybody sort of knew each other. He lived in Vienna from 1907 to 1914 and made the case for solidarity between the socialists and the communists, but it didn't work. And that gave Hitler even more ammunition for his future in Germany. Well, in 1913, Hitler left for Munich. By this time, he was virulently anti-Semitic, and he said, I've got to go somewhere where they speak German. I don't want to be in a country where they're all busy. It was before World War I, but where they're busy speaking Czech or speaking Yiddish or God knows what. And so he was going to fight the Jewish Revolution. That's what he said before the war. So finally, and I couldn't find a picture of this because I don't think anybody took it at the time, you have to picture the young Hitler by 1912, when he was very poor, getting ready to go to Munich. He was covered by what was called a bicycle coat, nondescript. His hat missed a feather. He couldn't take his coat off because he didn't have a decent shirt. And his pants were one big hole, his trousers. His shoe soles were worn through, replaced by paper. So he couldn't go out much. He couldn't go anywhere. He spent his time mostly in the non-smoking reading room, painting his postcards and reading all this race theory. And at night, he went to the opera sometimes. And one night, so Karl May's lecture and so forth, still loved all the music and so on. But his new personality was all set. And he left May 24th for Munich, had gotten the legacy from his father, which finally came through, and supposedly left to study architecture in Munich. But then the war came. He had a new friend, Rudolf Hausler, he went with, in Brigitte now, in the apartment house. But the war came, and so everything changed, and he wasn't going to become an architect. But I just want you to know, by this time, there was already the doctrine Serbien must sterben, Serbia must die, led directly to Sarajevo, and World War I, which broke out, of course, in 1914. So it's true that after the war, after World War I, at the beginning of the Weimar Republic, it seemed as if as awful as Hitler was, after all, he was defeated in 1923. He was jailed for 5 years. There was his putsch did not work. And the Nazi party did not have that much adherence. These awful stories I told you, maybe it was 10%, 15% of the population. That didn't happen until after the crash in 29. But on the other hand, I believe myself that it was completely inevitable if you study Weimar, even though they had all these wonderful things and interesting people and great doctrines, philosophy, sociology, psychology. In fact, I think if you read the Constitution, the new German Constitution, we had all the splinter parties, and there was the famous Clause 48 where you could dissolve Parliament. The Chancellor could dissolve Parliament under certain circumstances. That was true in Austria too, the dissolution of Parliament. So it was like a tinderbox. And I think one of the things we have to remember, and then I'm going to stop now, is that it's very different from the United States in this regard. Germany and Austria were countries that had never had democracy. Democracy is very difficult to have because you have to have endless meetings and endless compromises, and it's very boring. You know that. You sit at meetings, you have to agree, you have to vote. And on the other hand, the vote alone doesn't guarantee democracy either. The Germans certainly learned that. And after all, they had lived in a monarchy, very autocratic state, even under Bismarck. They had no experience of democracy. It's 1919, where already, for instance, the Jews were hated because they thought that they had something to do with Germany losing the war, and that was the rumored thing. And then people suffered and were very poor, and Germany was in a terrible state. And however many great or wonderful art they had, great theater, with wonderful things going on. It's true that so many of the communists were Jews, or rather many of the Jews were communists and certainly socialists. And it was like a tinderbox, so that when Hindenburg appointed Hitler the chancellor, he was not really even yet the chancellor because the parliament hadn't been dissolved yet. But after the Reichstag fire, that was inevitable in Germany. And in Austria, it's amazing it didn't happen sooner. The only reason you didn't have some kind of, again, Hitlerite revolution in Austria is it was a small country that didn't matter very much, and where politics wasn't as important, and where in the 1920s, the Jews actually led a kind of, like my parents, led a charmed life. They all had help. I hate to say it, but that was a big thing they cared about, having servants who were very poor and led a terrible life. And it was very intellectual, and they had wonderful circles, and they could walk to the book theater, they could walk to the opera, and they had enough money. Many of them had country places. They had done very, very well. So they really didn't see the handwriting on the wall. It's a terrifying story. So I might go on with something about Weimar in a minute, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perloff, for that fascinating glimpse into Hitler's Vienna, a tour that I'm sure few have had the opportunity to experience with such a knowledgeable tour guide. So thank you for that. I do have a couple of questions. We do have a question answer time right now. So if you have a question, please go ahead and at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little feature. Just click on that and you can type your question in, and then we will hopefully have time to get to them. So we do have the first question is from a student asking regarding the Anschluss. Was there a great traitor to the Austrian people like Vidkun Quisling from Norway?
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't get that thing.
Was there a great traitor to the Austrian people? This is regarding the Anschluss, like the Vidkun Quisling was to Norway.
They were nothing but traitors. Most of them were. The people that were appointed were traitors from the beginning. At the very end, in 1938, my grandfather was a major diplomat, so I know this all through him, but he didn't see the handwriting on the wall at all. The prime minister was Schuschnigg, who was a rather weak person, and who thought that somehow he would be able to save Austria from the Germans. But there was already the terrible case in 1934, and I frankly don't understand why my family didn't leave after that. In 1934, that prime minister, Dollfuss, who had been a Catholic priest, he had dissolved parliament. The parliament did all kinds of bad things, of fire, and he dissolved parliament, and that's really known as Austro-fascism. It was pretty bad in a way, but Dollfuss meant well, and he hated the Nazis, and what they did is they thought they had Mussolini on their side against the Nazis, which proved to be a big mistake. but they originally were friendly with Mussolini because he supplied them after World War I with grain, and they were broke. They had no food, nothing. So it was a very terrible time in that way. But there were so many people. Anyway, Dolphus, who was the prime minister, and there's the play by Brecht, Arturo Ui, about that. He was simply murdered in cold blood in the parliament. Now try to picture that. It would be like, all right, Nancy Pelosi not only having had January 6th, but that they openly went in and would have killed her in cold blood, and and there was no apology, and nobody did anything about it. It was just that Dreyfus was gone. So then the next person became prime minister, who was sort of next on the list, and he was okay, and he wanted to have a plebiscite. And so they were going to have the plebiscite. Schuschnigg went to visit Hitler in Berchtesgaden, thinking he would get concessions. And instead, Hitler screamed at him and said, we're going to march in tomorrow, no plebiscite. And they did. And von Papen, you mean like Quisling, von Papen was a terrible person who had been appointed and who was in the Austrian parliament. And it was one of the main people in the parliament, main ministers, was a total traitor, a la Quisling. So that's what happened.
Another student is asking, how much had German-speaking cities outside of Germany, like Vienna, been influenced by Weimar Republic's growing modern and progressive society?
Well, that's a very good question. They had the exact same thing in Vienna. Some of the great, I've studied it in my book, Edge of Irony. The writers between the wars in Austria were some of the great writers of the world. You had not only Freud, after all, nobody could be more influential than that, and Wittgenstein, one of the most influential. You had Schnitzler, you had not so much visual artists, but in theater and in the literature, you had incredible writers, an incredible group of writers in those not much more than 10, say 15 years. And they were very progressive and also very forward-looking. But that's only made the others even matter. So the progressive did certainly influence. And people went back and forth from Germany to Austria all the time. So it made a big difference. And they were also progressive. Red Vienna, as it was called. You had housing, exactly what you had in Germany. You had very good housing built for workers in the Karl Marxstadt and so forth. There was a lot of Marxism in Vienna. But of course, that's in cities. And in Vienna, there are not many cities, really, and you have this countryside, and nothing was more Nazi than the Tyrol. And Salzburg, if you go back on the map and look at Salzburg, which we could do, here, by the way, here's Hitler on March 15th in 1938, the famous picture, arriving in Vienna, giving his famous speech in the Heldenplatz. Look how many people are there in front of the Hofburg. There's Hitler addressing the people. And, well, never mind. Okay, let's have the other questions.
So we had a couple more student questions, more specifically about Hitler. One student asked, did Hitler obtain wealth through any means before he became chancellor, or was he still struggling financially until he gained control?
Struggling financially all the time. But once he lived in Germany and started the Nazi Party, he did have people who gave him some money. He wasn't starving in the same way. He was still very poor. He had no money. And then he was in jail. And actually the jail time, unfortunately, was very good for him. He wrote Mein Kampf, and then he didn't have to pay anything. So by the time he got out of jail, was it 1928? The next year there was the crash. Everybody was poor. Everybody was broke. It was just a terrible time with soup kitchens, again, in poverty. But by this time, Hitler had enough support from various rich industrialists and people, a lot of people, business people, who admired Hitler very much and channeled money to him. So that's a good question. So he wasn't as poor anymore. No.
Another student is asking, besides inspiration from people like von Liszt and Schörner and then Karl Lueger's funeral, what are other factors in Hitler's environment that taught him how to mobilize Germany?
Well, I think during the war, well, first of all, the way he had studied Parliament. He was very clever that way, the way he had studied how Parliament works. And he already during the war, during World War I, decided that no, this is going to have to be a fascist country somehow. And the whole idea of order and pageantry. Now, The pageantry he may very well have learned from the opera, from the kind of pageantry you did have in Vienna, the parades for the emperor and so forth, that he gathered people. But as far as getting all the people, it was all negative. They hated communism. I think both in the Weimar book you're using in the course and in the other Weimar books, like the Dimmenberg book, I happen to think that what is completely understressed is the role of communism. I don't know why that's so. You have to bear in mind that people were terrified of Russian communism. We're in 1933, where Stalin is already a terrible dictator. This was the time of the Russian famine, where they starved in the now Ukraine half the population. And even if people didn't know about that, they knew that a communist revolution would mean the loss of their private property. They understood that, and that they would have to give up their houses and their private property. So a favorite slogan was, well, fad Nazism, yeah, pretty bad, but better than, if you weren't Jewish, it didn't affect you that much, better than communism. At least it's not communism. At least, and the same thing was true in Vienna. The hatred of communism was enormous, and the fear of communism, and that these people would come and rape our women. The Russians would come, they would take control. After all, German communism was in the direct pay line and everything else of Stalin and Russian communism. So I don't know why quite that's underplayed. Being a communist was no joke. The communists themselves, like the people in theater, all the various people, Brecht, so on, may have thought, okay, we're just very idealistic. It's a very idealistic thing. And it was, and they were naive about it in a way. But the fact was that is what most people feared. And that made it much easier. Without that, Hitler never would have succeeded. And as I said before, if the socialists and communists could have come together, they would have had the majority. And then there wouldn't have been Nazism, and I don't know what would have happened then, but that is always something to think about, is that you do need a center when you have, as we have in this country now too, when you have such extremes, it's bound to be bad. It cannot be good. Even if you think your extreme is the right extreme, it just doesn't work. And the United States has always worked at its best, probably, when there was very much of a center and the parties weren't split. I don't ever remember a time that the parties was quite split the way they are now. When you get that, you have a lot of trouble, and that happened. And the anger, first of all, just that the Jews were powerful, and I say did own the newspapers, so they controlled the media and what people were thinking, and that's terribly important. Who controls the media? So that in other words, people stood ready for some kind of attack, and they especially wanted to attack the theater. They thought it was pornographic. They thought the novels, like the one you've been reading in the class, were kind of pornographic and disgusting, and we shouldn't have that for people. And so it was not that hard for Hitler. I read the book 1933 carefully now. There's a new book coming out this August from Polity Press, translated, called 1933, The Winter of Literature. And what he does in this book, it's a German, the author, his name is Wittstock, Uwe Wittstock, is he begins on January 30th, the day Hitler came to power, and he takes every day of the following month. And Hitler didn't have all the power yet, but he had a lot of power. He takes every day of the subsequent month and shows you what kinds of things were going on and what happened. And you really can't believe it. One of the first things that happened is they took the arts organization, like here, the Academy of Arts and Sciences, something, the arts organization, which Heinrich Mann, Thomas Mann's brother, was ahead of. They got rid of him, and they went to the thing and they looked around to see who looked Jewish, quote unquote. And then they took those people to the bathroom to see if they had been circumcised. And if they were circumcised, it meant they were Jewish. So that the next thing they did was cart those away right away to a concentration camp. This happened about a week after Hitler came to power in 1933. So when people say nobody knew, and, how could you? Of course, everybody knew. And people left very quickly. I mean, the list of people, so many of the leading people. Einstein was away in America, and he never came back, never set foot on German soil again. But many of the others left immediately, all the conductors, Bruno Walter, the leading people in the arts left, but of course they thought they were just leaving for a short time and they'd be back, that things would be okay. When my family left and went to Switzerland, I was too young, I don't remember it, but there were evidently conversations about, well, where should we go? Should we go to Italy? What an idea. Think of what Italy was like. Well, where would you go? France? Not too likely. And my paternal grandfather had the good sense to know you have to go to the United States. But people didn't want to go to the United States very much. America was regarded at that time in the 30s as a kind of gangster country where people shoot out of cars and a lot of guns and not cultured, not at all cultured. And besides, they didn't have any money. They didn't necessarily speak that much English. It's very hard to make up your mind to do that and to leave. But in fact, something like 15% of the Germans left right away. But what about all the others? It's amazing how many stayed behind and kept thinking this will blow over. And in Austria at the beginning, there was the same thing. This is sure to blow over. There can't be that many people for Hitler. Well, look at how many. And in the other pictures I wanted to show you, there are even, more, keeping people from getting into the university. As early as the late 20s, in the Vienna University, people like my uncle Otto Kurz, who was an art historian, they were just kicked off the steps of when they would go into the university, the steps of the university, the Nazis would come out and kick them off the steps. And so my uncle was quite ill and didn't come to class for about 2 weeks. And when he came back, his professor, Julius Schlosser, who was not Jewish, said, my dear Kurz, I'm so sorry you've had this bad thing happen to you, but there's really nothing we can do about it. That was the attitude, pretty much. And the Jews somehow did not realize that this is, this was it. Nobody quite realized it, although I think, as I say, that once Dollfuss had been murdered in cold blood, the chancellor is murdered in cold blood, and you can get away with that. Well, what was really going to happen that would have been good? I don't know, but it's very hard to leave. I guess that, is the answer. I'm going to stop sharing and then come back to it in a minute.
I have a couple more questions that
Yeah.
I'm hoping we have time to get to. One of them you sort of started to touch on. So, and this is from actually your friend Esra here in the library. She was asking, her question is, how are these stories that you're telling as part of this research, how are they shaping the world we live in today? And do you see any similarities between the world we live in today and the stories that you just talked about?
Well, I used to say, no, there's no similarity. I'm glad Ezra's asking that. I used to say, oh, no, that's silly, because our democracy has been a democracy for hundreds of years. We do have checks and balances. If you think what happened January 6th, it was stopped very quickly, however awful it was. It was stopped practically immediately, and nobody really, there would have been, I think, no question of a takeover. So I don't think it's quite as bad, but can it happen here? And can some of these things happen? I've changed my mind somewhat in recent years because things are so divided and so hostile. I am very upset personally at what goes on in the university these days on both sides, the far right and the far left. Nobody's allowed to say anything. Books are banned. Okay, the right has now banned all these books, but the left, you're not allowed to read Huckleberry Finn. It gets to be really ridiculous. And you have endless sort of a culture of punishment here too. I've never seen in my lifetime, and I'm very old, I have never seen, even during the Vietnam War, I have never seen the United States so, what can I say, demoralized. Although a lot of progress, I would say, has been made as far as race goes in this country, at least from the 1930s and the 1950s, at which time we know it was really awful. I think a lot of progress has been made, and a lot of progress could be made, but there is very bad feeling and, very great hostility, obviously. And the fact that somebody like Trump could get that far, and in other countries, never mind the United States, fascism, in Italy, where a fascist was elected president. Now you can say in Italy, the government changes all the time, but it's not good news, certainly. And there's so much threat of fascism around the world. And after all, China, our rival power, let's face it, what is it? It's an autocratic, it is basically a fascist government with a little overlay of Confucianism. I've been to China numbers of times and I have many Chinese friends. And I think one of our faults today is that we do there's no use constantly bad-mouthing the Chinese and saying, oh, the Chinese virus and how awful China is. It only makes things worse. And I feel the same way, frankly, about Russia, where there are very few people who feel that way. I have an article coming out right now on Tolstoy. I think the idea that we can't show Russian art, some of the greatest art the world has ever known, Russian music, in the 19th and 20th century, Russia has maybe had the greatest of these things, Russian literature from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky on down, because it's Russian. I mean, that attitude is just as bad as what it's fighting. So I don't think we would ever have it here. And let me try to end on a euphemistic note, namely, why did it happen in Germany and not France or England? And I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think it could have happened in England or France, those two countries, say the Netherlands, but I mean big countries, because they had a tradition of parliamentary government and democracy for years, and from the French Revolution on down in France, and the English from the Glorious Revolution on down, even if they were imperialist, even if they were colonialist, they did have parliamentary democracy. So you couldn't do these things. Now, the Germans thought they had parliamentary democracy, but it was all new and they didn't really know how to run it. And the idea of having these endless splinter parties and constant elections, and if there's anything we should learn from all that, is election alone does not produce democracy. Awful people can get elected. Hitler, in a way, got elected. Mussolini was elected and was not a fascist immediately, had been a socialist, actually. And so you have to be careful about elections and realize there have to be other things. There have to be laws, and there has to be belief in the justice system. And I'm still with all that's wrong, I'm still a great advocate of American democracy, because at heart, I think the system does work. But it certainly is being tested today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perloff, again, for your talk, for the Q&A. I do want to make sure we end on time, simply because class is almost over. You finished exactly perfectly. Thank you for doing that. That was perfect timing. But I know that we have students that are going to need to get going because they're here for class. So I want to thank everybody who's joined us this afternoon. I want to let you know that we will be uploading the recording of this presentation to the Rogers Center YouTube channel within about a week. So again, thank you all for being with us today, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. And thank you to students for those very good questions. And thank you, Jessica and Marilyn. Thank you.